It is ironic now, with the distance of hindsight, that the period between the two phases of the Martian invasion of Earth was seen at the time as a great, probably the greatest moment in human history. With the alien invaders temporarily laid low by terrestrial diseases they had not taken into account, humanity at that time thought it had actually won the initial conflict of the first phase. This hubris took the form of a triumphalism that manifested in excessive displays of both patriotism and internationalism that sat uneasily with each other, despite Dr. Rudolf Foss, Associate Professor of History at Christ Church University, writing at the time, "For the first time, humanity is united. A common enemy ended the enmity among us, and we now come together as a whole people, not excluding our basic differences, but allowing those differences equal places at the table of international brotherhood and cooperation." Of course, there were those who warned against such complacency. The personal account of his own travails during the first invasion phase by Fabian socialist Herbert Wells was popular not only for bringing a humanist touch to the account, but Wells himself toured after the publication of the book, warning anyone who would listen that the Martians were "not done yet," in his prophetic words. He was, of course, not the only one, but popular crowds preferred such a message from a published writer and journalist than from, for example, Professor Raylan Grave of the Observatory at Kingsford, who, with his staff, monitored the red planet continually for signs of potentially dangerous activity. His last written work, published in the St. John's Scientific Annual, made clear that the Martians indeed were not done yet, showing what activity could be seen with the human technology at the time. Of course, all these warnings were ignored, and so for the Martians it was a simple expedient of studying human and other animal blood, developing systems to remove the dangerous elements and, in doing so, inadvertently discovering ways to enrich the fluid, making it even more nutritious for Martian physiology. With that, it was just a matter of trying again. While various governments and territories the world over had examples of Martian technology, they found it difficult to reproduce. The Martian tripod fighting machines, as we understand now, were not just vehicles, but surrogate bodies in which the Martians themselves, essentially just giant brains with faces, lungs and a nervous system, would place themselves and operate. Martian technology essentially was largely based on artificial extensions of the Martians themselves. As for the dreaded heat ray, it relied on elements not found on Earth and not replicable in terrestrial conditions. The second phase, then, not only took humanity more by surprise than the first, but was swifter and deadlier. In a matter of 6 terrestrial months, 90% of humanity was exterminated. A year later, and the surface of the planet Earth looked as if it had never been anything else but another Mars. As for what to do with those humans who were kept alive for farming purposes, a series of trials were made as to the best practice, with various experiments happening around the planet. In some cases, humans were kept in restrictive conditions with no external stimulation apart from feeding and maintaining temperature. In these cases, breeding was by proxy. Human sperm was extracted, inseminated into human wombs, and pregnant human females were basically trapped in their beds until giving birth, whereupon the newborn humans would be immediately placed into a collective and mechanized nurture chamber until it was old enough to withstand regular bleeding. Martians noted that humans did not last long under these conditions and began casting for different ways. One version of the penitentiary system was to allow humans more of a free-roaming lifestyle in sectioned areas, but cultivating a predatory culture in which certain humans were allowed more license and impunity. This, the Martians observed, kept the human herds in better check. The majority were docile and unresistive. The favoured minority depended on extra favours and their privileged positions to the herds. However, no attempt was made to fully monitor human behaviour outside of what seemed necessary, and rebellions inevitably occurred. In one case, an entire herd, a group of 73 individuals ranging from old age to newborn, collectively suicided, leaving only the 5 favoured individuals, who were soon exterminated afterwards. But the best results came from the kind of free-range farming that occurred in more temperate zones of the planet. Whole communities of humans were allowed space, resources, and limited freedom to live as they would, with obvious exceptions, mainly breeding, which was always manipulated by the Martians. Interestingly, Martians found the human propensity of religion favourable in these cases, which was one of the main reasons these experiments were more successful. Martians never fully understood human tendencies to religion, as the Martians themselves were largely rational and logical thinkers, having abandoned much of their own irrational urges centuries ago. They knew what religion was, descriptively, but not the human need for such cosmic viewpoints. Religion, in these cases, allowed humans to marry and breed in controlled circumstances that suited Martian requirements. It also allowed humans to maintain their own basic sense of place, their humanity, while at the same time enduring Martian colonisation. Blood extraction operated under a voluntary basis. All humans in these communities were required to give blood, but it was seen as a form of taxation for the privilege of being able to conduct their affairs largely in their own way. While there was inevitable resistance, it never reached the critical points that other farming experiments had reached. The use of force became less necessary, allowing the Martians to apply their resources to other needs. After a few human generations, the Martians themselves being technically immortal, thus never breeding themselves, the conditions were regarded as status quo, and apart from the odd self-styled rebels, who were more tolerated than repressed, the situation was convivial and, from the Martian point of view, effective. Thus, this free-range form of human farming became the norm. There were, however, wild humans, and they presented threats only in so much as they were able to breed. Under their conditions, though, this was problematic. Most of Earth had been Mars-formed, made more like Mars was in its earlier pre-extinction period. With sufficient water, Martian plants like the yellow foam and red weed could grow exponentially. Martians cultivated planetary surfaces like gardens. There was little, if any, actual wild areas. Thus, those humans who were able to escape being farmed found themselves in a literally alien landscape. Nonetheless, future generations of feral humans adapted, and it was these that the Martians considered the greatest threat. Such humans had little access to technology, Martian or Terran, and what remaining human buildings they found were dilapidated and dangerous to inhabit. They adapted themselves to a primitive and dangerous lifestyle, in which food and water was scarce due to Martian wholesale extermination of most Terran life forms. They themselves had little use of animals, Martian or Terran, apart from farmed humans, and colonial domination of water sources. Under such circumstances, the usual human evolutionary response, to breed, became proficient. Thus, herds of wild humans would be detected and targeted. Contact between wild and farmed humans was scarce, but did occur. Communication was, at first, not monitored, since Martians initially did not see the wild humans as a threat. But exchanges of information, materials, and even individuals became more widespread and thus a greater threat to Martian hegemony. The response was always the same. What wild humans existed would be exterminated. It was not uncommon for Martians in fighting or working machine bodies to appear in farmed human communities with groups of wild human corpses to hang and display in obvious places. Although not an emotional species themselves, they had learned to appreciate the value of such grotesque spectacles and their emotional impact on their humans. As things stand now, though, the wild humans are having greater difficulty, both in staying alive themselves and in convincing the rest of us to join them in either exile or rebellion. For it is right now, at this moment, that the material and cultural standard of the human race could not be higher or more stable. We give our blood once a week, and the rest of the time enjoy a high standard of living. We have our own comfortable homes, our own collective public spaces, our own farmed food and access to potable water. Free from the real need to work, since the human farms are largely automised, and since what building, reconstruction and other necessary work is also automised, albeit supervised by humans for human standards, always under the watchful eyes of our Martian overlords, we are permitted our own pastimes and entertainments. The arts are booming. We allow ourselves memories of our great past, memories often tainted with propaganda and exaggeration. Our religions are diverse but subtly similar to each other towards sexual continence. Some continue to study the sciences, but with Martian technology so far ahead of ours, it seems more like a quirk of eccentric individuals than our best and brightest seeking to raise humanity to newer heights. In short, all things taken into consideration, we are content and comfortable. Wild humans, for their part, are neither of those things. But neither are they really free, as they would claim. They live in caves, in ruins or underground. They have little access to food or water. They lack the technology and the means to develop the technology to improve their lot. Above all, they are always hunted. Freedom, it seems, is the freedom to be hungry, thirsty, afraid, and in constant danger. It should be no surprise that at the end of the day, humanity that still exists today, under the sufferance of our Martian masters, prefer the slavery of our peaceful and plentiful communities than the freedom of impoverishment and the constant threat of death.